The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 8. The Myth That Wouldn't Die. One of the most fascinating discoveries that any serious investigator of the occult eventually stumbles upon is the fact that the same messianic content, heavily flavored with Eastern mysticism, dominates all communications received from alleged quote-unquote higher intelligences by occult means. This is true whether the messages come from spirit guides or from space brothers, and whether they are received through Ouija boards, by automatic writing, in seance or other hypnotic trance, on a drug trip, or in TM or other forms of yoga. The evidence seems to point inevitably to a central intelligence behind all psychic occult phenomena. Even UFOs seem to fit this pattern. Brad Steiger wrote, quote, "I have been engaged in UFO research since the 1950s, and I have come to the conclusion that, throughout history, some external intelligence has interacted with Homo sapiens in an effort to communicate to our species certain basic truths. An evolved intelligence whose manifestations we have been mistakenly labeling our quote-unquote gods has been challenging us, teaching us, and preparing us to recognize fully the God self within each one of us." Unquote. Here we have it again, the ancient promise of godhood. The recognition of, quote, the God self within, unquote, which Steiger himself believes, is associated in the Bible, as we have already seen, with Satan and Antichrist. That fact, however, seems to concern very few of those who have adopted this Hindu occult philosophy. They are so convinced by the reality of their experiences that nothing else can influence them. Like their American counterparts, a number of Soviet scientists are convinced that quote-unquote higher intelligences have long had a continued interest in our world. They theorize that astronauts from advanced civilizations in other parts of our galaxy, visiting Earth in the past, inspired many of the stories about gods in the scriptures of Earth's major religions. Dr. Vyacheslav Zaitsev, one of Russia's top space scientists, thinks Jesus of Nazareth was a cosmonaut emissary from another planet. And in this light, the, quote, coming of God to earth, unquote, was a, quote, genuine cosmic occurrence, unquote. Such theories have caused speculation that the increased UFO activity of the past few decades is part of the signs in the skies associated with the Messiah's second coming that is predicted in the Bible. Rejecting the theory that Jesus was an ancient astronaut, Christians believe the biblical account, that his birth in Bethlehem, not a spaceship, brought Jesus to this earth. Increasing numbers of Westerners, however, are adopting yet a third idea, that Jesus of Nazareth was a reincarnation of the quote-unquote Christ spirit that lived also in Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad, Zoroaster, Krishna, and many other great religious leaders. This concept has a special appeal for people who are looking for ways to unite all religions. Syncretism and ecumenism are two of the major goals of the New Age movement, which has its own prophecies about the coming New World Order of peace and prosperity. Prophecy, Precognition, and Crises. Not very many years ago, few non-Christians were interested in such ideas as the Second Coming, the Battle of Armageddon, the Great Tribulation, and the end of the world. Quote-unquote prophets were laughed at. Few educated persons took seriously the idea that future events could be predicted. This attitude, however, has gradually changed. Although they are almost always wrong, a host of previously unknown psychic seers has made enough accurate predictions to convince Mr. and Mrs. Average Citizen that visions of the future are not necessarily all phony. And today's broad-minded approach makes it possible to believe in prophecy without attaching any religious meaning to it. It's just part of nature. Or is it? Modern science has recently stunned the skeptics by giving solid verification of prophecy. Known today as precognition, the ability to foresee the future is accepted by scientists around the world as just another amazing mind power for which there is no real explanation at present. We will examine the possible explanations in a later chapter. Some of the most interesting demonstrations of precognition have occurred in the laboratories of Stanford Research Institute during quote-unquote remote viewing experiments. In these tests, a computer picks at random a point somewhere in the world, giving only its latitude and longitude. Amazingly, certain psychics have been able to describe the unseen sight with considerable accuracy. This ability is called clairvoyance. More amazing, however, is the fact that several psychics were able to describe the sight before the computer picked it. Psychic research is extremely dangerous because it seems to open the mind to alien influences that create an undesirable effect, which used to be called demon possession. In laboratories around the world today, white-smocked investigators are verifying psychokinesis, telepathy, and other mysterious mind powers that until very recently were the sole province of yogis, voodoo priests, witch doctors, and spirit mediums, and were laughed at by science as self-delusions. Predictions by well-known psychics have increasingly involved the theme of a hoped-for Messiah who will bring lasting peace and prosperity to earth. Skeptics argue that times of crisis have always produced a revival of the messianic myth, and that today's renewed interest in the Second Coming is simply a psychological reaction to the overwhelming problems now faced by humanity. There is no doubt some truth in this allegation. Nearly every century in the past has produced a number of persons who claim to be the Messiah. However, there are at least 100 times as many would-be messiahs on earth today as at any other period in history. Is this just another coincidence? On top of this, there is a growing sense of expectancy in both scientific and religious circles that some apocalyptic event is soon to occur. Signs of the end? The very crises that our modern world now faces, which presumably create a climate favorable for the rise of messiahs, were predicted in detail by Jesus of Nazareth as signs that would signal the approach of his second coming. Quote, wars and disturbances, great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, terrors and great signs from heaven. Unquote. This particular prophecy has been dealt with often and in detail by many writers and lecturers. There is something else, however, that Jesus said would herald the nearness of his return and the end of current human history. This was the very first sign that Jesus mentioned to his disciples when they asked how to recognize the quote-unquote last days. Therefore, this sign must be of special importance. Quote, and Jesus answered, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Unquote. Critics have tried to explain away Christ's declaration that wars, pestilence, earthquakes, and famines would signal the last days. They have called this a lucky guess that hit upon the inevitable result of a cooling earth, exploding population, and stagnating social order. But there is no explaining away the prophecy that just prior to his second coming, religious deception would be rampant on the earth, and that it would specifically involve apparent miracles performed by false prophets and false messiahs. The odds against many in the year 1982 claiming to be Christ are so astronomical as to be beyond calculation. The religious leaders of Israel sternly rejected Christ's claim that he was the Messiah foretold by the Hebrew prophets. They were determined to kill him and to make certain that his name would be forgotten, apparently unaware that in buying his betrayal and crucifying him, they were fulfilling exactly what their own prophets had said would be done to the Messiah. Though great crowds had followed Jesus at first, his popularity had quickly waned. Nevertheless, Jesus had the audacity to predict that in the last days, when nations would be seeking a super leader to rescue the world from destruction, such a man would be thought of as a Messiah, taking that title from Jesus himself. Within a week of making this seemingly foolish prediction, Jesus was summarily executed in disgrace, hanged naked on a cross between two thieves. Rejected by his own people Israel, condemned as a criminal by Rome, forsaken by his tiny band of followers who scattered in fear, and his grandiose claims apparently exposed as fraud, That should have been the end of the Nazarene. But it wasn't. 3 days later, his grave was empty, and with a boldness they had never known before, which was itself presumptive evidence for what they claimed, his formerly timid and inarticulate disciples began to declare with arresting power that Jesus the Christ had risen from the dead and had been seen and handled by them. This created such a dramatic and upsetting awakening throughout Palestine that both the Roman rulers and the Jewish religious leaders would have given almost anything to be able to produce the quote-unquote stolen body in order to prove that this revolutionary movement called Christianity was based upon a fraud. However, they were never able to produce a body. The best they could do was to spread rumors that didn't fit the facts. And today there is no explaining away the fact that 1900 years after Jesus made these remarkable predictions, including the promise that he himself would one day return at a time of great deception, the messianic myth is more alive than ever. Hundreds of millions of people in today's modern space-age world are literally watching, waiting, and hoping for the second coming, and the very signs that Jesus gave would seem to indicate that day is near. Even millions who are not Christians are hoping for a quote-unquote Messiah. And in almost everyone's mind, that title is associated primarily with Jesus of Nazareth, just as he predicted. A cosmic conspiracy? It is fascinating that so much of the literature involving UFOs has messianic overtones, including specific references to Christ. Alleged UFO contactees, widely scattered around the world, continue to receive messages about a coming Messiah, which are so similar that coincidence must be ruled out. The emergence of scores, perhaps hundreds of UFO cult groups within the last 2 decades, all preaching a similar cosmic gospel, along with the enthusiastic response of the public to such films as Close Encounters and E.T., and the inevitability of contact with beings not of this earth. For example, the Solar Light Retreat in Central Point, Oregon, publishes transmissions allegedly received from a space being, which are very similar to the entire New Age philosophy. There is talk of man's, quote, divine self within, unquote, that must be developed through a secret knowledge given to initiates, which in turn will aid their cosmic evolution to godhood. The Christ consciousness, or Christ spirit, is also mentioned often, together with the promise that spirit beings are soon to, quote, descend in vast numbers to planet Earth, unquote, in a cosmic second coming. The Mark Age Meta Center in Miami, Florida, has published voluminous teachings received from the Space Brothers about the God Self within, known as the Christ, or I Am Self, that God is not personal, but a force of which every atom and person is a part. The fact that there is a consistent theme and that it is so similar to New Age thinking argues forcibly for a conspiracy directed by some central intelligence. There is a persistent messianic overtone consistent with the core of the messianic myth in all ages, and there is increasing emphasis placed upon a common prophecy that, quote, the second coming of the spiritual world ruler, unquote, of planet Earth is very close at hand. Typical of the saucer cult messiahs is Alan Michael Noonan, who claims to have been commissioned by Venusians from the 12th dimension to, quote, help save the world, unquote. Leader of the One World family, Noonan claims to be in telepathic contact with extraterrestrials, or ETs, who will eventually establish God's kingdom on this earth through the spread of the everlasting gospel. According to Noonan, quote, galactic beings have a great plan to intervene directly into affairs here to bring on an artificial tribulation in order to ensure the success of world unification, unquote. Noonan claims to be God and the Messiah promised in the Bible. Amazingly, he calls his followers, quote, Agents 666, unquote, a number that the Bible assigns to the Antichrist. The natural inclination would be to write off Noonan and the many other cosmic messiahs representing various UFO cults as self-deluded pretenders or deliberate hoaxsters. But it isn't that simple. There are serious questions involved which deserve more than a cynical dismissal. What is the explanation for the recent emergence of so many widely scattered groups who all claim to be in touch with ETs? How is it that UFO cults in different countries, speaking diverse languages and unknown to each other, have received basically the same messages and in the same manner? We must either believe that large numbers of individuals widely scattered around the world have independently and coincidentally, in defiance of the laws of probability, all had the same hallucinations, or we must admit that a common outside source has been communicating with all of them concerning a planned takeover of this earth by quote-unquote higher beings. We are forced to consider seriously the possibility that intelligent beings beyond Earth have a selfish interest and purpose in preparing Earthlings to accept a personage they would like to install as their world ruler. Though it sounds like something right out of science fiction, this theme is so consistently predominant among the messages allegedly received from UFOs that it cannot be dismissed as mere fantasy. Is there a conspiracy of cosmic proportions to foist a so-called Messiah upon the world? Could the ultimate motive be to control the human race? How and why? And what relation, if any, does all of this bear to that remarkable prophecy that Jesus made about many false messiahs coming in the last days in His name? How can one be protected from the deception that Jesus specifically warned would accompany this profusion of would-be messiahs? The plot thickens. The current rash of messianic claims and expectations is not by any means confined to UFO occultists. There is a definite tie-in with the age of Aquarius and a well-documented relationship between UFOs and the occult. Anti-Christian investigator John Keel has observed, quote, "The manifestations and occurrences described in occult literature are similar, if not entirely identical, to the UFO phenomena itself. Victims of demonomania, that is possession, suffer the very same medical and emotional symptoms as the UFO contactees." Unquote. A U.S. government publication produced for the Air Force Office of Scientific Research has noted the same relationships. In the preface of the 400-page volume, on the basis of researching thousands of UFO articles, books, and other publications, senior bibliographer Lynn E. Cato had this to say, quote, "A large part of the available UFO literature is closely linked with mysticism and the metaphysical. It deals with subjects like mental telepathy, automatic writing, and invisible entities, as well as phenomena like poltergeist manifestations and quote-unquote possession. Many of the UFO reports now being published in the popular press recount alleged incidents that are strikingly similar to demonic possession." Unquote. Astrologers and psychics had long predicted that on February 5, 1962, a new Messiah would be born. Heralding the prophesied birth of this world ruler, who would bring peace at last to Earth, all 8 planets were in the sign of Aquarius, something that had not happened in nearly 2,000 years. This sign in the sky was supposed to mark the birth of the age of Aquarius, long awaited by mystics and occultists. Shortly before dawn on that special day, Jean Dixon, the psychic seer of Washington, D.C., had what she called the, quote, "most significant and soul-stirring," unquote, vision of her life. Mrs. Dixon saw a long-dead pharaoh and Queen Nefertiti at his side striding toward her. The queen was holding out a baby as though offering it to the world. Jean recalls reverently, quote, "The eyes of the child were all-knowing, full of wisdom and knowledge," unquote. As she watched in fascination, Jean saw the child grow to manhood, and a small cross that formed above him began to expand until it, quote, "dripped over the earth in all directions." Simultaneously, peoples of every race, religion, and color, each kneeling and lifting his arms in worshipful adoration, surrounded him. They were all as one, unquote. Mrs. Dixon believes that the Messiah was reincarnated into the world as a babe at the time of her vision. She says he will, quote, "bring together all mankind in one all-embracing faith, the foundation of a new Christianity with every sect and creed united. The world as we know it will be reshaped and revamped into one without wars or suffering," unquote. But Jean's experience is far from unique. In recent times, similar prophecies have come from other mystics and psychics. Though differing as to the exact date of his birth, There is surprising agreement among persons of widely varying beliefs that such a man, some call him the Antichrist, others call him the Messiah, is probably alive on the earth right now, biding his time. Moreover, for the first time in history, in obvious fulfillment of Christ's most remarkable prophecy, there are literally hundreds of persons living on earth today who claim to be the Messiah. Some of them number their followers in the millions. Through a worldwide publicity campaign, the human race has recently been called upon to receive as the Christ a man who bears almost all of the classic biblical marks of the Antichrist. Full-page ads in major newspapers around the world on the weekend of April 24 and 25, 1982, announced, quote, "The Christ is now here," unquote, and confidently predicted that he would make himself known publicly, quote, "within the next 2 months," unquote. That date passed without the much-heralded, quote, "reappearance of the Christ," unquote, but the terror centers that placed the newspaper announcements explained that the delay was only because the consciousness of the human race was not quite right, unquote, but that, quote, "Lord Maitreya," unquote, definitely would make himself known soon. How can one tell the true Messiah, if there is one, from the Antichrist? Which prophets are to be believed? Is the messianic myth that has so long been a central theme of science fiction as well as religion about to be realized at long last? Are we on the verge of a second coming? Or is the whole idea of a Messiah an escapist syndrome that surfaces periodically at times of great human crisis? Whatever the answers, these no longer seem to be idle wonderings, but questions of the utmost importance. The myth that wouldn't die. The persistence of the messianic hope is a phenomenon that cannot be waved aside. As one recent writer, though doubtful of all messiahs, has said, quote, "To call messiahs devils or heretics explains nothing. To dismiss them as mad or deluded is too easy," unquote. The gullible and enthusiastic have always been prone to follow a variety of Pied Pipers, but not the same old worn-out lie century after century. Therein lies a peculiarity of the Messiah syndrome that cannot be explained away. It has refused to die in spite of the history of shattered hopes and broken promises. Why? It is not enough to say that the human race has a peculiar weakness for this particular quote-unquote myth. If so, then we must explain that weakness. What is the basis? Critics have often scoffingly said that the idea of God becoming man to save humanity is found in many religions, as though this would discredit the concept. On the contrary, if a variety of conflicting religions adhere to a similar mythology, in spite of cultural barriers and the isolation caused by language differences, the probability must be very strong that some common seed of truth lies hidden in the myth. What is it? Assuming that the messianic hope is a myth without substance, then why hasn't modern man, with all of his sophistication, been able to free himself from this groundless tradition, if that's all it is? Apparently, that isn't all it is. Its source appears to be outside of the human imagination, psyche, or subconscious. C.S. Lewis believed most fervently that the biblical teaching about the Messiah was fact. Calling it a myth could not explain away the myth itself. Quote, "Where is the Epicureanism of Lucretius, the pagan revival of Julian the Apostle, the dogmatic materialism of the great Victorians? They have moved with the times, but the thing they were all attacking remains. The myth, if one insists upon calling it that, of God becoming man and dying for our sins, has outlived the thoughts of its defenders and all of its adversaries." Unquote. Tracing the myth to its source. Skeptics have attacked the Bible's teachings about the Messiah as not unique, claiming that it was borrowed from pagan religions. Then from whom did the pagans borrow it? Such arguments go around in circles and lead nowhere. In actual fact, the biblical teaching concerning the Messiah is radically different in several vital points from every other messianic tradition. Specifically, the biblical Messiah is God who became man, without ceasing to be God, in order to die for our sins, and was resurrected, not reincarnated, remaining forever the same, and who is coming again. In contrast, the pagan or occult messiahs are often men on their way to godhood, or one of the gods reincarnating again and again, such as the Hindu avatars. And of course, none of them dies for our sins, but assigns a path of good deeds or ascetic practices whereby his disciple can escape quote-unquote bad karma. There are definitely two sources of the Messianic myth, one for the Hebrew and Christian prophets and another for every other religion. It also seems quite clear from the evidence that neither source is human. How can we say that? In spite of differences, the Messianic hope is so widespread and so persistent that it must originate with an intelligence or intelligences capable of spreading the concept in the following manner. First, to peoples of every language anywhere in the world, and second, continuously throughout the entire history of the human race. That much is indisputable from the evidence we have. There is scarcely an ancient culture or religion of any kind where the idea did not persist that, quote, someday, in the appointed time when the gods ordained, unquote, a ruler would arise who would bring everlasting peace to the whole world. For example, an Egyptian prophecy from the 12th dynasty concerns a man who, quote, shall bring cooling to the flame, a shepherd of all the people, who will smite evil when he raises his hands against it, unquote. Comparable hopes were held in such widely separated lands as Greece, Africa, and India. The universality of similar beliefs is an indisputable fact not only of history, but of today's world as well. Worldwide communication was not humanly possible in centuries past, yet the Messianic myth was always widespread. Clearly, then, the quote-unquote myth has no human source. There are four possibilities that remain. Number 1, God. Number 2, Satan. Number 3, ETs. And fourth, the universal unconscious. The New Age is satisfied with either numbers 3 or 4. If there is a real Satan, then from his point of view it is immaterial whether humans believe numbers 3 or 4 to be the source, since either of them is a substitute for God. We can also say that neither 3 nor 4 could be the only source of the myth, since it has two versions that are diametrically opposed. And since the only opposition to either 2, 3, or 4 could come from number 1, then it seems clear that the God of the Bible exists and is indeed the source of biblical prophecies and teaching about the Messiah. The corollary would be that all messianic traditions that oppose the Judeo-Christian teaching have their source in the enemy of the God of the Bible, Satan himself. And the Antichrist? In spite of the overwhelming evidence, the New Age denies that Jesus is the Christ. As we have already seen, this denial is the primary identification of the spirit of Antichrist. Benjamin Creme tells us very boldly that the Christ he is promoting, Lord Maitreya, is not Jesus, thus clearly identifying the spirit that motivates him and the Tara centers that paid for those full-page ads. Jesus, says Creme, was reincarnated, apparently several times, not resurrected, after his crucifixion and presently lives in a Syrian body 640 years old. According to the Aquarian conspiracy, the new world of peace and prosperity will be brought about through a transformation of consciousness. This is the key to human evolution, and parallel to this is the teaching that the only thing that made Jesus the Christ for his day, that is, during that lifetime, was that he had attained to a quote-unquote higher state of consciousness called Christ consciousness. According to New Age thinking, we all have the potential to attain this state and thus to become Christed ones. Although the human potential movement founded by Abraham Maslow generally does not refer to our potential as Christ consciousness, the same basic concept is contained in the slogan, quote, human potential is unlimited, unquote. One can hear the hollow echo of this impossible dream reverberating across primordial space and time, and then through the corridors of human history. Quote, I will be like the Most High, unquote. This is the description given of Satan's downfall by the prophet Isaiah. No greater self-delusion can be imagined. How many quote-unquote Most Highs can there be? Yet humanity eagerly bought this lie, and not just Adam and Eve, but their billions of descendants, including those on planet Earth today in this new age. Like venom infecting the whole human race, the serpent's lie in the garden can be traced down through occultism, preserved in its most virulent form in numerous secret societies, from Hinduism and Tibetan Buddhism to the Gnostics and Rosicrucians, Theosophists and Hitler's own Black Knights of the SS Order. This messianic myth promises that a Superman who fully demonstrates the Christ consciousness, infinite human potential, will one day take control of the world. He will capture the imagination, allegiance, and worship of all humanity, because he will be at once the embodiment of New Age theology and the living proof that we can all attain godhood if we follow him. There is a great deal of information in the Bible about the Antichrist that seems to be receiving remarkable verification in our world today. Before moving on to that, however, let's take a brief look at several representative false prophets and false messiahs throughout history to see how they compare with Jesus of Nazareth and whether there is any consistency in the contrast.